Welcome to the New Horizons small group. For this, the first Sunday in a new year. This is January the 5th, 2025. I'm taping from home because currently in Kansas City we have a snowstorm and extremely cold weather. And most of the churches in the area have closed because of the inclement weather. So this morning we are continuing our study, though, of the books of Exodus and Leviticus. We're using the Explore the Bible curriculum. We're in session number 6 in the book of Exodus. The title of the session is Provision Given, and we're in Exodus chapter 16 and chapter 17. So Explore the Bible curriculum, session number 6, title Provision Given, and we're in the book of Exodus, chapter 16 and chapter 17. I can remember growing up seeing clips on the TV of a comic duo known as Abbott and Costello. My guess is many of the rest of you in our class have seen Abbott and Costello. Either their movies, which were generally slapstick type comedies, or some of their comic routines that they would have done on vaudeville. One of their routines, first performed by them in 1938, was a routine called Who's On First. Now, if I was present, I would ask how many people have seen the Who's On First comic routine, but since I'm not, I'm going to make the assumption that many of you have seen the comic routine that Abbott and Costello did called Who's On First. They weren't the first ones to do it, but they were the ones that probably everybody remembers. Now, if you've never seen the routine, go on YouTube and type in Who's On First, and it'll come up. In fact, it'll come up in multiple places on YouTube. It has been called the best comedy sketch of the 20th century. So what was it about? Well, it's a baseball skit. Abbott and Costello are on stage, and they're talking about the team that's on the diamond. And the gist of it comes down to what are the names of the players. And there's this interplay back and forth between Abbott and Costello, because the names of the players are who is on first. On second base is what. On third base is I don't know. In left field is why. In center field is because. The pitcher is tomorrow. The catcher is today. And the shortstop is I don't care. And if you think about it, you can see how you can get some real comic interplay between them. It sounds a whole lot better when they do it on stage. So go Google Who's On First and watch it. It's not a long skit, and it is hilarious if you've never seen it. So today, we don't have exactly the same thing going on, but in collegiate sports today, we have something called NIL. And it's a relatively recent event. Prior to NIL coming into being, college athletes were not allowed to use their name, image, or likeness to make money. They were amateurs, quote. So using their name, image, or likeness in advertisement, for instance, a Nike shoe, Gatorade soft drink, some type of advertisement where they got paid for it was illegal. Well, now NIL is legal. They're able to do that. So they're concerned about their name, image, and likeness. Professional players are the same way. They are very concerned about their name, image, and likeness and how well they perform, because this is how they make additional monies over and above the contracts that they have for playing the sport. So Many of them make more money sponsoring a shoe, an athletic shoe, or a drink, or think Patrick Mahomes and all the commercials that he's in. You know, he probably makes as much or more with the commercials as he does with his football contract. So, name, image, and likeness, or who you are, makes a lot of money for these professional and now collegiate athletes. In today's session, we're going to look at how God showed the Israelites who he was. So, where did we leave it last week? Well, so far in the book of Exodus, we have seen Moses take the people of Israel, the Hebrews, out of the land of Egypt, where they were under oppression, where they had been slaves for 400 years. As they left, they instituted the Passover as a remembrance of the death angel passing over the firstborns of the Egyptians. And then last week, Canet taught about the crossing of the Red Sea. And I've heard a number of people say that Canet did a terrific job. So Canet, thank you for teaching last week while I was gone. You did great from what I'm told. And I'm sure you did. After they left the Red Sea, that's where we're going to pick up the story. So we're beginning today in actually Exodus 15. Because after the crossing of the Red Sea, the next chapter is a celebratory song where the Hebrews celebrate what God has done for them. After all, he has freed them from slavery. He has helped them escape from the Egyptians who were trying to bring them back into slavery. They have crossed the Red Sea on dry land while the Egyptians were buried underwater and all killed as they tried to pursue them into the Red Sea. So there's a reason to celebrate. But now, as the Hebrews under Moses' leadership follow God from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, a number of things are going to happen. There are, in fact, 6 different events or episodes that happen as they travel, and it takes them about 3 months to get from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. Now, if you look at the maps that I handed out at the beginning of the sessions, you'll see that there are several different locations for Mount Sinai and several different ways that the Exodus may have taken place. Bottom line is, we don't really know which way the Exodus was, and we don't know for sure where Mount Sinai was. The traditional place for Mount Sinai is to come down the shore of the Red Sea from kind of a northwesterly direction to a southeasterly direction, and that's where we see Mount Sinai on the map. Now, whether that's the way they went, we don't know. But we do know as they traveled down, they had 6 different events to happen. So let's look at those 6 events just kind of in a general fashion, and we're going to look at 2 of them a little more closely this morning. So the first episode, the first event, takes place in Exodus 15. And Exodus 15 is where the Israelites have left the Red Sea. They have encamped for the first movement at a place called Marah, M-A-R-A-H. And Marah simply means bitter. And when they got there, they found that the water at Marah was bitter. So what did the Israelites do? They complained. They grumbled. They went to Moses and said, "You brought us here to die in the desert for lack of water." Well, God had just saved them from the Egyptians with the parting of the Red Sea. So was he going to leave them in the desert to die of thirst? Not likely. But a little bit of a revisionist history. The Israelites thought it would have been better if they had stayed in Egypt, in slavery. So Moses goes to God. God tells them to throw this particular tree into the water, and it changes the water to drinkable water. So lesson number 1, God's not only a deliverer, God's a provider. He provided for the Israelites drinking water. So they move on. they leave Mara, and they move on to the second event, which takes place in Exodus 16. And here they move through what's called the wilderness of sin. That's just the name of the wilderness. And here they find that not only is there no water, there's no food. And we're going to look a little more closely at this event in today's session. So I'll leave it with that. Just know that in this second event, they move into the wilderness of sin. There's no food, there's no water. And what do? They grumble and gripe again to Moses. More on that later. Episode 3 or event 3 takes place in Exodus 17, also part of today's session. They move on from the wilderness of sin to a place called Rephidim, where again there is no water. Again, the Israelites complain. Again, Moses goes to God, and God says, move out in front and hit the rock, and I'll give you water out of the rock. Again, those two episodes we're going to spend a little bit more time. But notice a pattern here. Anytime there's a problem, anytime there's a lack of something, the Israelites complain to Moses. Well, in effect, they're complaining to God because Moses is God's spokesman. But they complain to God. Moses goes to God. God solves the problem. Okay, episode number 4, event number 4. They had moved on from Rephidim, and a local king by the name of Amalek sees them and thinks, oops, I'm being invaded, and he attacks them. So there's a big battle, and Joshua leads the fight for the Israelites, and God provides a military victory. They defeat the Amalekites. And then episodes 5 and 6 deal with Jethro, who is Moses' father-in-law. If you remember, Jethro was a priest of Midian, which means he's a priest of a pagan god, but he's also a very big influence in Moses' life. Remember, for 40 years, Moses took care of Jethro's flock. Moses married one of Jethro's daughters. He's lived with Jethro for 40 years. But when Jethro gets to Moses, he acknowledges that God is greater than all the other gods. But more importantly, he counsels Moses that basically you're wearing yourself out by trying to take care of all these people. So therefore, you need to appoint leaders over them in smaller groups, and you just handle the big problems. Let the smaller group leaders handle the little problems. And by the time they get that settled, they're now down to Mount Sinai. And we're ready next week to look at the Ten Commandments and God's dealing with his people at Mount Sinai. But those 6 events that occur between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai are intended to teach the Israelites a lesson. It's intended to teach them that God is not only a redeemer, a deliverer, he's also a provider. And if you ask him for the smallest thing, if it's in his will to provide it, he will provide it. And he'll provide it on a daily basis. Later, when we get to the New Testament and we have the model prayer, we find the same thing in the model prayer where we are to pray, give us this day our daily bread. But here in this book, in Exodus, let's take a look at what happens when the Israelites complain about their lack of food and their lack of water as they're moving down from the parting of the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. So, we're going to start in Exodus. Let me get my new international version here. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 16, verses 11 through 12. 11 through 15. We're going to start with 11 to 12, but Exodus 16, 11 through 15. So at this point, we know that they've moved into the wilderness of sin, and they have discovered that there's no food there for them, and the Israelites have started to complain to Moses. So picking up at 11 through 15 in the New International Version. Moses has taken the problem to God, and this is what God's going to tell him to do. Verse 11. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumblings of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, What is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. So what does it say in the Holman version? Verses 11 and 12 in the Holman. The Lord said to Moses. Now, notice in both the New International and the Holman version, Lord is all caps. So anytime you see the word Lord in all caps, it's actually a reference to Yahweh, the Creator God, the God that spoke to Moses at the burning bush. So the Lord, Yahweh, spoke to Moses. I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Now, here when he says, I have heard the complaints, or depending on your translation, it may say, I have heard the grumbling. While it was directed at Moses, Moses was God's spokesman. So Moses got the complaints, but God heard the complaints as well. They were complaining against him. And basically, the Hebrew word translated here means we're discontented. We're not satisfied with our lot in life. We're going to complain about it. Well, that's important because when we get to the issue with water in chapter 17, the word that's used for complaining or grumbling is different. So we'll come to that later. But here, verse 12, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. We are dissatisfied. We're not happy with where we are. Tell them, Moses, you go to the Israelites and tell them this. At twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full. Then you will know that I am the Lord, again, all caps, I am the Lord your God. God's relationship with the Israelites here in the wilderness, remember they're going to be in the wilderness for 40 plus years. They are a series of teachings, if you will. He's trying to take a group of slaves and turn them into a nation. And to do that, they need to learn some things. Primarily, they need to learn how to be people of God. So they need to learn that not only does he deliver, but he provides. So notice they were complaining about not having any meat. So what does God say? I'm going to provide you meat at twilight, and in the morning I'm going to provide you bread. Well, for most of us, bread is just a side dish. But for the Israelites of this time, and for most cultures of this time, bread was the staple. It was the main course, if you will, for any meal. So God has said to Moses, tell the Israelites, I'm going to provide you with the staples that you need for your food. Quail and bread, and you're going to be full. Okay, verses 13 and 14 in the Holman. So at evening, quail came and covered the camp. So God promised meat. So that evening, a flock of quail landed, and they were able to capture, kill, cook, and eat meat that evening. Now, this was a natural occurrence. These quail are small migratory birds, so they were probably flying around, sat down in the camp. Israelites caught them, ate them, they had their meat. It was a natural occurrence. But notice, here's a supernatural occurrence. In the morning, there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, there on the desert surface were fine flakes, as fine as frost on the ground. Well, the flakes are what we will eventually learn is manna, but it evidently came down with the dew. And when it landed on the ground and the dew melted, and what was left were these fine flakes of bread that was manna. Now, what is manna? Well, look at verse 15. It says, when the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. Well, in the Hebrew, the words for what is it sound very much like manna. So the name became manna. We don't know what it is, but it's manna. It's bread. Now, lots of scholars have tried to come up with a natural place that this manna came from. So the scripture says it came down with the dew. Well, other people have tried to say, well, it's secretions from the ground, or it's something that grew on the rocks in the area. Well, the problem with that is it occurred every day for 40 years, except on the Sabbath. Didn't occur on the Sabbath. No manna was given on the Sabbath. And by the time they got to the Promised Land and they entered the Promised Land, it ceased altogether. So that's really not a natural occurrence. So the manna was God's supernatural provision of food for the Israelites. So he provided a natural provision, the quail, meat, and then the supernatural provision, the manna. Now, this is the only place in this chapter that quail is mentioned. The rest of the chapter simply deals with the manna. But they provided the food that the Israelites needed to take care of their physical needs. So let's look at 16 through 19. What are the instructions that God's going to give them? So here's the NIV version, starting with 16. This is what the Lord commanded. Each of you is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it out by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. Listen to the instructions that God gave to Moses. From the Holman, this is what the Lord, again, all caps, Yahweh, covenant God of Israel, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each person needs to eat. In other words, I promised that you would be full when you finished eating. So gather as much as you need to be full. Well, that could tell you all kinds of amounts. So it goes a little bit further. He specifies. You may take, Holman says, 2 quarts. So 1 omer equals 2 quarts. You may take 2 quarts per individual, according to the number of people each of you have in his tent. So God has commanded. He has placed an order on the Israelites. They are to obey what he has said. I order you, I tell you that you are to collect what you need for each person in your tent, and you are to collect it every morning. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Again, I remind you that the model prayer says, give us this day our daily bread. Well, God is providing to the Israelites their daily bread. Collect it each morning. Now, the only provision that's given a little bit later in the chapter is you're not to collect it on the Sabbath. So the morning of the Friday before the Saturday Sabbath, you're to collect double, so you don't have to work on the Sabbath. That will be one of the 10 commandments that we'll look at next week. But you are to collect every day what you need. And if you don't collect enough, well, doesn't say this, but He will multiply it till everybody in the tent has had enough to eat. If you collect too much, it'll spoil. Well, people haven't changed much. It's always good to have something for a rainy day. So there were people who collected more than they need with the idea that we'll have a little bit extra tomorrow if it doesn't show up. Well, guess what happened? It had worms in it the next day. You didn't do what God commanded. You didn't need to collect extra. You needed to collect what you needed for your daily bread. And those that didn't, the bread spoiled. Some lessons there that we need to learn as well, that we need to not worry about collecting more than we need. Now, that doesn't say we should not plan ahead. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we can depend upon God to give us what it is that we need. Verse 17 and 18. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. When they measured it by quarts, the person who would gather a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needs. So, God provided exactly what they needed. Verse 19. Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. So eat your daily provision. If you try to save some for the next day, it's not going to be there. It's going to spoil. And as I said a minute ago, as you get further into the chapter, what happens? It collects worms. So it's not edible. So God's command is to do this. Except on the day before the Sabbath when you are to collect enough to get you through the Sabbath. So that took care of their bread. That took care of their meat. It's time to move on. So this is the third little episode or event that took place. We're in chapter 17, and we're going to look at verses 1 to 6. So chapter 17, 1 to 6, they have now moved on from where God provided the manna. He's still providing the manna each day, but they're moving on to another location. So, verse 1 through 6, chapter 17. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. So again, God's leading them by the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. He's directing where they go. When the pillars move, the Israelites move, and they move as a group. So they're moving on from the desert of Sin. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So as at Marah, they got there, and in this kind of, instead of the water being bitter, there was literally no water. So what do? Not a surprise, verse 2. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. The Lord answered Moses, walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And I will stand there before you at the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Okay, Holman version. The entire Israelite community left the wilderness of Sin, moving from one place to the next according to the Lord's command. Again, when the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire moved, then the Israelites followed. And they went along behind, and Moses was the leader. They camped at Rephidim. So the next place they went, it's been 3 months now since they left the Red Sea parting. They're down at Rephidim, which is about a day's journey to Mount Sinai. And they're camped, and they expected to find water. And guess what? Not only was there no bitter water, there was no water of any type. No water was present. So what do they do? Not a surprise. Verse 2. The people complained to Moses. Now, when they were previously complaining to Moses, remember I said it was a sign of dissatisfaction or discontent? And I said later when we get to chapter 17, the word's different. Well, here's where it's different. Translated into English, in the Holman it says complained. In the New International it says quarreled. The word is much more harsh here. The word is a legal term that means to like bring charges against somebody, to protest, to attack, if you will, somebody. So this, it's not a matter of just we're discontent with what's going on. We're mad enough at you to stone you. And that's kind of what it looks like that Moses is concerned about, is they're going to stone him to death. Because now he's taken them into the desert and there's no water and they're all going to die. Again, revisionist history. It was much better in Egypt where we were slaves. Let us go back. Revisionist history. They're not remembering right. But again, their quarrel is not with Moses. Their quarrel is with Yahweh God, because he's the one who's leading them. But again, in other places, Scripture says that God tested the Israelites. He's trying to teach them a lesson. That not only does he redeem them, but he provides for them. Verse 3, but the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. Again, grumbling, quarreling is a harsher word than used previously. They said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Again, something I said previously. God split the Red Sea to bring them away from the Egyptians. Now he's going to let them die of hunger and thirst? Not likely. But sometimes when difficulties are faced, we tend to blame someone. And in this case, the Israelites are blaming Moses, but really and truly they're blaming God for not providing for them. Yet he has provided water at Marah. He's provided meat and bread previously. They're not depending on him to do it again. They're just depending on themselves. And they need somebody to blame for their situation, so they blame Moses. Verse 4, then Moses cried out to the Lord. All right, Moses has had enough. God, what should I do with these people? In a little while they will stone me. Well, God has already told Moses back at the burning bush that he and the Israelites are going to worship God where the burning bush was. Well, the burning bush was out Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. So God has already told Moses that they are going to meet God at Mount Sinai. But Moses himself is getting a little frustrated. His spirit is a little bit broken here because, again, the people are beating up on him because they don't have water. So again, God has a solution. Verse 5, the Lord answered Moses, go on ahead of the people. In other words, get out in front of the group. What I'm going to do, everybody needs to see. Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Okay, those people he appointed to be the leaders of the smaller groups. Take some of them with you. Go out in front. Take the rod you struck the Nile with in your hand and go. And if you remember, this staff was the one that Moses threw down and it turned into a snake. He struck the Nile and it turned to blood. It brought the plagues on Egypt. So this staff in Moses' hand is, if you will, a picture of God's power. So he says, take the staff in your hand and go out in front of the people. And then verse 6 says, I am going to stand there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and the people will drink. So if they want water, I will give them water from a rock. Moses did this in the sight of Israel, and water came forth. And God provided for them again, just like he had provided throughout their journey the last 3 months. You know, we're not that much different sometimes, as I said a minute ago, from the Israelites. When we face hard times and we see no way that we, and I emphasize we in quotes, that we can solve the situation, we forget that we have a God who parted the Red Sea. We have a God who provided food for the Israelites for 40 years in a wasteland, in a wilderness. We have a God who can do the impossible, but we don't always call on him. So as we leave the session today, I just remind you that while with man there are things that are impossible, with God nothing is impossible. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day and for the lesson today. And we thank you that while with us there are things that are impossible to take care of, with you nothing is impossible. You are the God of the impossible. Just like when you told Moses to move out to the Red Sea when it was blocking the Israelites, you opened the Red Sea and they passed through on dry land. Just like when they complained there was no water and no food, you provided. You provide for us too. May we remember that each day of our lives and praise you for your provision as well as your redemption. For we ask it in your name. Amen.